Hello class, today I'm going to be teaching you how to make one of these little decorative snail bottle openers here. I heard in the class a few people were saying that they wanted to make one of these, and so I figured it would make a good demo. Works on a lot of scrolling, obviously, as well as splitting, just like how we did with the forks. So let's get into it.
Alright, so as you can see, I'm starting off with a pretty big piece of rebar here, and I wanted to include this even though this portion of the video didn't end up panning out exactly due to some cracks that were in this rebar before I even started, but I felt I should include it just to let you guys know I make mistakes too sometimes. So here I'm working on what will eventually become the shell of the snail, and it's just a whole lot of drawing it out, which by this point in the class I'm hoping that you are comfortable with. It was at this point in the process that I recall seeing some cracks forming, and I probably should have called it quits at this point, but I decided to venture on and see how I could do. And there are some of the cracks that I was talking about. Now I'll eventually round out the other end, but for right now I'm leaving it square, just so I have something to hold on to, or rather for Dr. Showalter to hold on to while I begin chiseling apart the head of the snail, the part that would become the eye stalks. And this is the part in the process where I really started to give up on the rebar, because you'll see here in a second that a crack formed, causing this to split into three parts instead of cleanly into two. And you can see the crack is already there. I probably should have given up a while before this and started fresh on a new piece, but sometimes your ambition will get the best of you. Notice that I am using the aluminum plate because I plan to cut all the way through using the chisel, and you can see how much of the plate that I am gouging out each time I hit it with the chisel. That's the reason you don't want to uh, chisel directly onto the face of the anvil, or at least not when you are finishing a cut. So as you can see here, I gave up on the rebar, threw it into the water, and I got a smaller piece of round stock. It was just something that was sitting in the scrap bin, and I did the exact same thing to the tail, and now I'm just showing cutting and finishing what will become the eye stalks of the snail. Alright, once you're through those, you're going to split it open. I used the corner of the anvil to split it open. Since this is so long and because we've already tapered one end, we can't exactly use the hardy cut tool to split it open like we were able to with the forks. The way you open this up on the corner of the anvil, which I apparently didn't get footage of, is you will just put the cut straight down and hammer at a delicate angle, which will sort of coax them into that 90-degree angle. So now I'm just working the stalks of the eyes out a little bit, and as you can see here, I'm taking some care to hit towards the base and try to leave a bit of a bulbous head on the end there. It's just a stylistic choice. They didn't end up looking that nice on my piece anyway, just because of how the metal split. And so if I was to fully finish this, I would probably have to do quite a bit of file work or grinding on a belt sander to really get those eye bulbs more rounded off than they end up being. And about at this point, Dr. Showalter notices what I'm trying to do, and he graciously allows me to use his guillotine jig here, which is very similar to the fullering jig that I have, except it's not a spring, which makes it a little bit easier to work with, actually. But what that does is it allows me to separate the eye from the eye stalk very nicely. And after I had this drawn out as much as I wanted it, I just copied all of the steps on the opposite side. After doing that, I went ahead and rounded out the tail since I wasn't going to need it to hold on to anything anymore. Again, this is something that I'm hoping you know how to do by this point in the class. And as you can also see, this is a fairly long taper. That's because we are going to need a lot of material to scroll up into the shell. So now I'm going to begin the scrolling. In previous projects, we've taught you to try to keep your scroll nice and even and centered so that when it's finished, it's basically a two-dimensional circle. Here, we actually want you to make it somewhat lopsided so it ends up being more of a conical shape than a flat circle. So as you can see here, I am sort of working it to one side each time I knock it over the corner of the anvil, and that will let it curl up a little bit off center. And now, even though we are past our taper, we're going to continue working this up because you want the shell to be roughly proportional to the amount of snail that you actually have. If I finished it here, it would look teeny tiny on a extremely long snail. That was me just trying to knock it down, get it a little bit more off-centered. And here I am just drawing it back a little bit more. And now we're going to make a bending point for folding this over. And the way you do that is you are going to shoulder from both directions. So you can see here I am driving that shoulder down on the near face. Takes a second to establish the shoulder, but I eventually get it. I'm not working with a terribly long piece of metal at this point, so it's a little bit awkward to work with. But you can see just going back and forth, hammering that shoulder, drawing that bending point down a little bit. And then we are just going to knock it over the same way we would if we were initiating a scroll. And because we have that bending point, it'll make a nice little fold. And after this, we're just going to work that tail out. Now, we're not working hot enough that this is actually going to weld, so it's going to try to open up on you. Those halves are probably not going to draw out super evenly. Be careful while you're working this, because if you get one side too thin, then you run the risk of snapping the bending point and ending up with two halves of a snail. Now I must have missed the footage where I bent the eye stalks up, but that's how you make a snail.